Okay, looks like we're all set.
So good morning, everyone. It's great to be here in DC with you all. It's always exciting to be in our nation's capital. Although I do have to say I'm a little jealous of my family at home right now because our sweet corn is ready and they're all enjoying it without me. So I'm really hoping that when I get home later this week that I can still get some too. So and in a moment I'm going to show you a picture that what that sweet corn looked like a few weeks ago whenever I really didn't think we were going to have any. But today I'm going to be talking about the corn supply side of things, the demand, what we're seeing in price trends, and then some macroeconomic factors. So to start out on the supply side, so I wanted to do a progression of what we're looking at with drought right now. So I feel like this is the big thing that's been on everyone's minds this summer, and I know some areas have gotten some rainfall that's changed conditions of those crops, but this is back on March 7th, and in a moment here I'm going to start the progression to go all the way through July 11th, so you can see how the heaviest portion of the drought has moved, shifted north a little bit and eastward, and now it really encompasses a large area of some of our major corn producing states. And then just another look at that. This is March 7th again. I changed it to gray so you can see the overlay here, and then the top layer is July 11th. So you can see where drought used to be a few months ago and where it is now and where there's some of that overlap. What we have now is a smaller severe drought area, so that's a positive. The severe drought has actually declined, but as I mentioned a minute ago, we've had drought expand from part of Iowa to basically all of Iowa, expansion from no part of Illinois to mostly all of Illinois, expansion of that D3, D4 drought in Nebraska, and particularly in eastern Nebraska, and then expansion from part of Minnesota into mostly all of Minnesota, and those are our four largest corn producing states. So obviously as we think about what does that mean for the supply side of our balance sheet, and we'll get into that here in a minute. And this also is another way to look at what those numbers are showing us in that corn area in drought. Currently 64% of corn area is estimated to be in drought. A year ago that was 30%. So you can really see how that is encompassing more of our corn area. So what does this mean for crop conditions, yields, and prices for this year? We'll be digging into all of that here. So this picture is my little guy out in our backyard, and the front few rows that you see that are shorter, that's that sweet corn, and that's what I was talking about. At this point, I was thinking we really weren't going to have much sweet corn this year. The field corn behind it is not really looking so hot either at this point. It's pretty uneven, not nearly as tall as we would normally have at that time. I will note that the corn still looks pretty green. We had quite a bit of subsoil moisture coming into this year, but you can tell from the grass that we are dry. And just to show you all where I'm located, I'm in Knox County, Illinois, kind of in the northwestern part of the state. And then we came home on July 2nd. We were driving home from church, and it was pouring down rain for like the first time in months. And my kids love jumping on the trampoline with the sprinkler underneath it, and they're like, hey, can we jump without the sprinkler now? And they managed to get their swimsuits on in like 90 seconds, and I just wish I could get that kind of speed in the morning when I'm trying to get them up and going. And then this is July 10th, same view, and all of those that's all the same field. It's just the first picture is a little bit different there. But you can see that on July 10th, that field was fully tasseled, and it's looking pretty good compared to just how we looked a few weeks ago. And so I asked all of you in this room, if any of you don't already know about this, we've been doing a text survey trial group that action team members and NCGA board members were invited to participate in, that we've been running for a couple months now. And so if you're not in that or you don't know about that and you're a grower, please talk to me or Galen and we can get you into that. But I asked the text survey group to send me some photos of what their corn looked like on those same dates. So these were all from July 10th to July 22nd to give us a view of what corn's looking like out there across our corn growing regions. And so you can see here that some of the corn is looking pretty good. Some of it, you can see that the drought stress, particularly in parts of Colorado, Missouri, Nebraska. I'm going to start here. This Nebraska in the bottom left is actually a video. The message with that said that they were cutting that and going to replant sorghum. So, and I'll note that the ear from Iowa was 40 by 16. Did I get that right? Okay. And so that's a pretty good looking ear too. So now the critical thing is what's weather going to do over the next 2 weeks, or next 3 weeks, depending on where you're at in that pollination period. That ear shows that the ear size is there, and now we need to get those all pollinated. So I forgot to mention at the beginning, but I have a few Slido questions built in here. So I want everyone to get out their phones. This one is a grower-only question. I'll have some other questions later that all staff can participate in. But tell us what % of your corn is in good or excellent crop rating. And for anyone who doesn't already know this, here, I'll get you so you can start doing that. For anyone that doesn't already know this, the crop condition ratings that USDA puts out are very subjective. There's usually one person per county that follows whatever their own methodology is for determining that. So I'm just saying, why don't we define it as if you think it'll yield at or above your APH, what % of your corn do you think will achieve that? And I had to kind of keep my ranges pretty narrow to make sure that they all fit up on the screen at once. Go ahead and enter what you're thinking. Again, what % of your corn do you think is at or above your APH for those farms? And we'll take a look at how this compares to what USDA is saying. And this afternoon, we'll be getting new numbers on crop conditions from USDA. So for now, we're going to be looking at what they said last week. And those ratings from last week, here, we'll see where we're at on. Okay, those ratings from last week go along with the same timing as the pictures that I showed you from our farm and all the pictures that many of you shared with me. It looks like there's still a few coming in, but I think we're pretty much set. So it looks like about a third of the corn you're thinking is going to be okay, sorry. This is kind of confusing how I did this here. About a third of you think 75% of your corn is going to be in that good to excellent, 25% in that 60 to 75% range. Maybe the better way to look at this is where are we at on the 40 to 60 and below. And so it looks like maybe about half-ish of about 43% is maybe below that 60% of its, I don't know. This is not the way, I've got too many percents going here. Percent ranges and percent coming in. Anyway, looks like maybe about half of it might be below that, maybe that good to excellent rating level. So that's actually quite in line with what USDA said last week. So I wanted to talk about where USDA is at on crop conditions. Again, we're going to get new numbers out coming up here this afternoon. But as of last week, USDA was saying 55% of the corn is at that good to excellent rating. Again, this is pretty a subjective rating, but it's also kind of informative as to what the crop's looking like. And then that was up from the previous week, which was 51%, compared to last year at 64%. And I'll also note that last week's rating, even though it was some improvement from the prior week, it's still the lowest rating for that week that we've had since 2012. So yes, we are seeing some improvement. It'll be interesting to see what happens today. I know some areas have continued to get some rains. And then, so here's the states that have a very low good to excellent rating. So these states have less than 40% good to excellent. And these states also, over the last 5 years, have accounted for 21% of the nation's production. So we've got about 1/5 of the production coming from these states, and these states are, as of last Monday, really struggling in terms of how that corn is looking. And then here's our states that are less than 50%, the states that are less than 65%, and then the states that are less than 80% and greater than or equal to 80%. And I should say not less than 80%, but between 65 and 80%. I think you all know what I was trying to say there. And so those states that are green are the states that are faring the best right now in terms of of their condition ratings. But those states only made up 11% of the production over the last 5 years. So again, we've got where we have some of our highest producer states in that worst rating. So as we think about what that means for national yield, we'll talk about that a little bit here. And where we were at last week on crop conditions ratings, there's only been 11% of the years since 1986 that were equal to or lower than that in terms of where we're at on good to excellent. I'll also note that as of last week, these are the stats for corn that was silking. So, what's ahead in terms of the forecast is also really important. Like I said, even if we made it over that first hurdle of having the ear size there in some fields where those ears are looking good, we still have got to get them all pollinated. So what is the drought outlook for the next few months? So there is USDA and puts out the seasonal drought outlook. And actually, it's not USDA, the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, puts out a 3-month drought outlook. And so this one shown right here is February. In a minute, I'm going to start the progression that shows the outlook, and it's going to be like February month in for the next 3 months, March month in for the next 3 months, and so on, all the way up till the current one, which is that it came out June 30th for July through September. So we'll take a look at that here. So this is where we end up with the current drought outlook for the next 3 months. And so you can see that throughout the Midwest, they're showing that drought is going to improve but continue to persist over the next 3 months. So that's kind of that long-term forecast. I know I heard from a few of you last night who were concerned because you had no rain in the forecast for the next 2 weeks, and again, that being a critical period. So this is still going to be, I think that the weather story isn't as strong as it was, but it's still there as we work our way through the next month. So now let's talk acres in production. So initially, USDA was projecting 92 million acres of corn, and just on June 30th in the acreage update, they raised that to 94.1 million acres of corn. So there's an increase of 2.1 million corn acres. So while we've been concerned about production and yield, given the widespread drought conditions, USDA made this big move to say there's a lot more corn acres out there, and we'll look at what that means in terms of supply in a minute. But what I was maybe more interested in than that change in planted acres, which came as a surprise to most analysts and in the industry, but I also thought it was interesting that harvested acres got bumped up from 84.1 to 86.3 million acres. If any of you listened to the Maize Market Minute I did last week or the article that went with it, you kind of probably saw my comments on that. But what I thought was interesting about this is it indicated that USDA, or I should say the farmers responding to the survey that USDA put out bases these results on, are not expecting a more than normal number of acres that don't get harvested for grain. So that was kind of the takeaway that I thought was interesting. And then just last week in the World Ag Supply and Demand estimates for July, USDA lowered yield from their initial projection of 181.5 down to 177.5, 4 bushel per acre decline. This could have been due, I think that this was a combination of a couple things. One, they were making a move for some weather-related reasons, but we won't see if there is greater weather-related reductions that are that are warranted at the time. They probably won't make another move on that until August or maybe even September, whenever farmers can be out in those fields and checking to see what actually was pollinated and have a better frame of yield references there. Also, with that extra 2.1 million planted acres, that means we have some corn growing maybe in some areas where it's not quite as productive as others. And so because of that expansion of corn acres, with that comes probably some expectation for a little bit lower yield. And you've all probably heard me say before or read in some things I've written, I think that 181.5 was a pretty lofty initial projection. One thing, and also I'll note here, 2 years ago, USDA started tracking in that June acres report where they put out that 2.1 million acre increase and said there'll be 94.1 million corn acres. They started also asking farmers how much of that is left to be planted as of the date of the survey, which is in the first 2 weeks of June. And this year, there was still 2.5 million corn acres left to plant. So we saw the jump from 92 to 94.1, but 2.5 million of that was not actually planted as of whenever the farmers were surveyed in the first 2 weeks of June. So I definitely think that's something to keep an eye on. I think most areas had the weather in the first 2 weeks of June to continue to keep planting, but did they continue to do that? And both of the last 2 years in which USDA has asked this question and reported this number, there have been a lower number of final planted acres because some of those anticipated acres were not planted. So I'm going to keep an eye on that. One thing I will note is that, so here's the yields over time. These are the national yields for each year. 176.7 is the record high yield, and that's highlighted there. Here, I've added in February estimates and July estimates for each year, along with the actual yield. And one thing I want to point out is even though USDA just dropped the yield projection down to 177.5, if we achieve that, that would still be a record yield. So it's kind of funny to think about the possibility of being at a potentially record yield level in a year where we've had the weather set up so far that we have had. I do think that'll probably drop a little bit more, but the next couple weeks will be pretty telling on that. One thing that I'll note, this, on average, the years shown in here, this have a 0.9 bushel per acre decline in yield from the July estimate to the final yield estimate. Of course, there are several years that increased, some that decreased a lot. That does exclude 2012, which was a big decline. And then, again, assuming all 94.1 million acres are planted, I do think that we might see some more drop in that yield number, but we'll keep watching what happens with weather. Okay, so what does all of this mean when it comes to the corn supply side of the balance sheet? USDA is projecting what would be a record high production year. Again, it's kind of interesting to think about that given what we've had so far. Production would be quite a bit higher at 15.3 billion bushels than what we saw last year, but last year's yields were impacted by drought, especially in parts of the western areas of the Corn Belt. And USDA did just lower our projected beginning stocks number for the year. And so that's when we look at the whole supply side. That's also, changed what the supply side looks like for this year. And another note here is that as of June 4, that's the last time that USDA reported planting progress, and 96% of the corn was planted. So kind of going back to what we just looked at with are all those 2.5 million unplanted acres going to get planted? We don't really know what USDA would have said the following week if we would have saw continued progression in planting or if some of that stopped. But anyway, so that's kind of the supply side and what we're looking at there. We're going to move into the demand side here. So when we look ahead, and the numbers in the right side column are showing the change from the current 2022-23 marketing year to the 23-24 marketing year coming up. USDA is, the export projection for this marketing year keeps coming down, and I'll look at that closer here in the next slide. But USDA is still holding out strong our export number for next year. They're projecting a 27% increase to get back more in line with exports that we've seen in recent years prior to the current marketing year. And then also they're positive on potential for changes in domestic demand and a 5.5% increase in total use. So hopefully we see that demand from all of those sources. This year has been a little bit down on the demand side, and so hopefully as we look ahead, especially if we have that potential record production that they're projecting for right now, that we have those demand uses. Here's another look at the demand side with more granularity. Some of you had requested seeing this view of it as well. So I won't spend a lot of time going through this, but you can see the breakout of all the different types of domestic corn uses broken out there as well. And so when we look at where we're at on exports so far this year, like I mentioned, exports have been down this year. When we started this marketing year, USDA's projection for the 22-23 marketing year for corn was around 60 million metric tons. That was that early projection. And we're down to 41.9 million metric tons in the July report from last week. Over the course of the past year, they've slowly been lowering that target rate. The good news is that if you look at our projection based on the last 5 years, that trend for these weeks of the marketing year that we have left, we are on pace to hit very close to where USDA is at in that projection. So hopefully we can keep up with that pace and hit that number where they're at right now. I think they finally gotten to a place where we are on target to hit that. As you can see, though, we're quite a bit behind last year and the 5-year average, and that's what I was saying. And we'll dig into a little bit more about why that is and what's going on. Here I'm showing Mexico and China. Again, the dark solid line is this marketing year so far, and then we have the prior year and the 5-year average shown as well. And exports to China sort of leveled off around in the early 20 weeks of the year when Brazil and China started importing corn from Brazil for the first time in November of 2022, which is where we kind of see our exports flatlining rather than that upward trend. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in Brazil here in a minute as well. And then, of course, what's going on with Mexico, as we all know. So another issue with maybe impacting some of our export numbers for this year is drought impacts on the river and export transportation. And not as big of a number for corn as soybeans or some other crops, but looking at the Mississippi River levels, the first one shows the month of June, and then the second one shows month of July through early August. And I positioned them like this because the scales line. So I drew that line across there to show you that where the number is on the second graph, that's the same number in the scale on the left side as the right side. So you can see here projections for the Mississippi River levels over the next month. And just for reference, last fall during harvest, when there was some transportation delays and low river levels on the Mississippi, we hit a low of negative 3.09 feet on October 24th, and this is the St. Louis number. The record low is negative 6.2. And current projections are for early August to be in that negative 2.25 to negative 3.5. So hitting that point of where we were last October. And then I also pointed out where the actual level is on July 11th. So anyway, as we look ahead to this harvest, if we continue to have less than normal rains, that could be a factor going into this harvest season as well. Another thing just to mention, the Panama Canal is also having some of these types of issues where there's weight and depth limits and more costly shipping rates. So those types of things can hinder what that means for exports of our agricultural products. So looking into some of the big factors in terms of export and world market. We have what's happening in Ukraine and their production and export challenges, and then the Black Sea grain deal, which is set to expire today. It was, the most recent renewal was in mid-May. They renewed it for 60 days. Russia, this morning, breaking news is that Russia says they will not agree to another extension. And so, I don't know, that's looking like it's not going to continue at this point unless some concessions to Russia are made. Russia wants more of their grain and fertilizer to have a destination. And initially, when that agreement was made, the United Nations did agree to help with that somewhat because there was a need for their resources and production, and so that was part of the goodwill of the deal. I will note that I don't know, I should have checked wheat price this morning. I'm not sure if it's reacting. Corn price was not really reacting. I think the expectation was that we weren't going to see a renewal on this. And also, Ukraine's been making some changes in their export patterns to try to avoid the Black Sea. Russia really hasn't been allowing that much traffic over these past 60 days anyway. So I'm not sure that this will be the major market mover that maybe it would have been if Russia wouldn't have agreed to an extension, say like last fall or something, before Ukraine had made some changes to their other export options. We have the ongoing issue with Mexico. I'm going to be diving into updating some of the trade flow data later this week. And so you probably watch for some information on that. But Mexico has been kind of changing how some of their import patterns. And so that's something that we've been watching aside from the GMO issue. What's interesting is, when you look at maybe they're importing some more from places like Brazil and South Africa, but it's, those nations are also growing GMO corn at about the same rate as the United States. So they're not getting non-GMO corn from those places. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic added in on this. Of course, we have China relations, which are maybe strained right now, rocky right now. I don't know what the right word is, but just in general, between the two nations, that make things complicated. China's also struggling in terms of economic recovery from COVID because they didn't actually reopen till earlier this year, and the recovery has not been nearly as robust as what had been anticipated before that. And so, demand from there has not been as big as had been expected in general. And then we also have what's going on in Brazil, where they've had major corn production and export growth. And in the interest of time today, and because Brazil has kind of been a focus of some of my work for the past week or two, that's where I'm going to spend our time this morning when it comes to exports. But first, here is a graph that kind of shows the world share, individual countries' share of world corn exports. And then with the 22, 23, and 23, 24 projections being on the far right. But that Brazil is in the green there, and you can see that they've really grown in terms of world share of the corn market over time. The United States in the red on the bottom has fallen from over 60% in the first year shown here, down to between 20 and 30% in recent years, or 20 and 35%, 25 and 35%. Ukraine in the yellow has also grown as an exporter over the last 15 years. For next year, they are not expected to export near as much, given the situation that's going on there. Argentina had drought stress this year, and their crop was reduced, and so they did not export as much. Argentina's there in the blue. If you look to the second to right column, their bar's quite a bit smaller. And so I know I actually got the question earlier this week. Argentina is expected to grow about 20 million metric tons in exports next year, and the question was, where is that coming from? Like, is another nation being, is that going to impact the United States? Of course, these are all projections at this point, but USDA's projection also has world trade increasing by 20 million metric tons approximately. So if we look at that addition from Argentina isn't really, or their rebound to their norm is not really coming at the expense of another nation, at least not in those projections at this point. So Brazil. This graph shows the black line is world corn production, and the blue bar is the United States percent of that, and the yellow is Brazil's percent of that. And so Brazil has grown as a corn producer. They made up about 7%, 6 to 7% of the market share 15 years ago, and currently about 11, they produce close to 12% of the world's corn here looking at this year and next year. And so Brazil has been expanding corn acres, which is how they're expanding production at this rate. And yeah, there we go. Okay, and so they've been exporting more too, which has been big news over the past week or so. And this looks at, again, similar to the last graph, but instead of production, it's exports. Again, that black line is the total world exports of corn, and then the blue is the United States, and the yellow is Brazil. And we can see here that Brazil has definitely grown in terms of being a major corn exporter. The big news has been that Brazil is set to export a greater quantity of corn in this marketing year, the 22-23 year, than the United States. This would be the first time that's ever happened, except for 2012 and 13. If you look over at that year on here, you can see that, you know, as we all know, we had a very much drought-reduced crop that year, less corn to go anywhere. And so, you know, Brazil helped to fill that void in the world market. As we look ahead, I think the big question on everyone's mind is, you know, is this going to continue? Can this continue at this pace? You know, what does the next 5 to 10 years look like in terms of what they're going to do? Is this you know, what does this mean? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So this slide is from a Farm Doc webinar. Joanna Calusi is a postdoc student there. And she is actually from Brazil, and she's a former colleague of mine, and just a really, really excellent resource when it comes to all things Brazil and crop production. And so if you look at this map of Brazil, in the northwest corner, that's where the Amazon rainforest is, that gray area. So there's not any cropland there. And then this shows what's coded red is where they're growing 2 crops of corn, or excuse me, corn as a second crop following soybeans. There's some parts of Brazil where corn is grown as a first crop and a second crop. That's that yellow area. The green area is where corn is only grown as a first crop. And then there's an area too where corn is grown as the third crop of the year, which makes a small portion. That red area there where corn is grown as a second crop following soybeans makes up about 3/4 of their total corn production. And so here, I'm basically saying what I've said. Okay, so Mato Grosso is this red, the red area where the arrow's pointing to. That's where the largest area for expansion is. So where they're going to be expanding is into an area where they're going to be growing more corn as a second crop. The reason that that's an area for expansion is because over the last couple decades, there's been deforestation in that Amazon rainforest, and then areas that are deforested are getting converted to pasture land, and then croplands expanding into the pasture land, and it sort of keeps moving farther north. The good news is that aside from illegal deforestation, deforestation is not really happening anymore. You have to have a special permit, and those are extremely limited. But the current president that just started in January is also very much cracking down on illegal deforestation. So for the time being, what is currently crop and pasture land is sort of the room for expansion of cropland, which is, you know, a good thing for us in terms of corn and our industry, but also just for global sustainability and the preservation of those rainforests. Here, this shows the green area surrounding about 2/3 of this graph right here represents all the area that's in rainforests or other forested lands, natural vegetation, or public and private protected lands. And so that represents land that is not available for cropland. The 30% in the orange is what is potentially available or is being used for ag and cropland purposes. I'm going to jump ahead here, but crops currently make up 7.8% of that, and the rest of that is pasture land. Some of that pasture land crops could be grown on, and some of it they could not. So there's room for cropland to, this is what's mind-boggling to me, there's room for cropland to potentially expand even with no more forest area coming into play, because it can take up some of that pasture land. We'll talk more about like what the dynamics are that dictate if that will or will not happen, or what pace that'll happen at. I wanted to note here that over the last 5 years, the average annual increase in Brazil's corn acres has been 3 million acres. And for reference, Missouri over those same 5 years has harvested an average of 3.2 million acres. So what they've done over the last 5 years is basically add corn harvested area the size of what Missouri is harvesting for 5 years. But we look at corn yield. The yields in Brazil are roughly half of what they are in the United States, and that's because it's being grown as a second crop. I've seen some notes that indicate that the lower yields are because it's non-GMO, and I just want you all to know, if you didn't already know, that Brazil grows about 95% of their corn is GMO. So this has nothing to do with that. It's because corn's being grown as a crop following soybeans. And then another thing I wanted to note here is that in 2020, so USDA puts out what's called the Total Productivity Index figures, and 2020 is the most recent year for that. In 2020, one thing that really caught my attention is that Brazil used 112% more fertilizer per hectare than in the United States on their cropland. And so, I mean, we can understand that they're growing 2 crops. And so, if you think about if you pool together 2 years worth of fertilizer, you would have more fertilizer than 1 year of fertilizer if you were aiming to grow 2 crops there. But I haven't had a chance yet to dig more into the dynamics behind this, but I think, one thing that we can think about as we learn more on what's playing into that is that they're using more than double, which if we had, say, a corn year and a soybean year together, we would not be using double the corn fertilizer, right? Because soybeans don't use near as much. So that's staggering to me, and so I think something that could be an advantage to us, especially as sustainably produced products become more and more important, is that we are using less fertilizers, and some of those things that we are hearing about a lot. And I guess the other end of the spectrum is, at this point, do the buyers in the world market care about that? Because they also have to find that important to make that matter. At this point, I don't know that that's even a factor, but in the future, maybe that could be. So when we look at Brazil in terms of infrastructure, Brazil is 86.6% the landmass area of the United States, and that does include Alaska. And Brazil only has 25% of the roadway miles as the United States, and less than 5% of the paved roadway miles of the United States. So they are making investments in infrastructure, and they have grown their roadway miles in recent years. But if you think about the amount of increase in production and exports that they've had over the last, say, decade, and they already have way less capacity for storage than they are producing. At some point, you get to a point where they're having bottlenecks getting to the ports. They had farmers who are being forced to sell grain at prices that they don't want because they have to clear space for the next crop. And so while I do foresee that there will be some cropland expansion, we already talked about the potential for that, I think that at some point they're going to be reined in a little bit by just where to even go with this, and until they, long term, will they get the infrastructure to support that? Probably, but in the short term, there's been some dynamics even just this year with their record crop that have caused some problems and resulted in farmers getting quite a bit lower price than normal. Just for reference, throughout the months of May and June, the price of corn in Brazil was about 75 cents lower per bushel than here in the United States at the same time, which is another reason why we saw those buyers turning to Brazil, because the grain was so much cheaper there. There was some dynamics playing into that. One was Brazil had a record corn production year. U.S. had a drought-reduced production year. And the exchange rates, relative exchange rates between the two nations highly favored the Brazilian price in the world market. So, those three dynamics aren't going to happen year after year after year. And so I think that it was kind of the combination of those things. So I guess, I think as I look at all these things together, I think Brazil will definitely continue to be a strong producer and competitor in terms of corn exports. I don't see how the trend of the last decade can continue at the same pace, because some of the other limitations and the fact that we're not going to have, that exchange rate, low production and record production all happening at the same time always. So just wanted to turn to the domestic demand side of things for a minute here. The Energy Information Administration puts out a long-term forecast through 2050. And so I looked at, as we look at what motor gasoline use will do over the next couple decades till we hit 2050, if we wanted ethanol, if ethanol were going to remain a constant at the current 10%, I just realized that my label on here is kind of confusing, but what it's really doing here is what happens if ethanol remains at that constant level that it has been. We continue to need higher percent rates in order to meet that current use that we have. So, for instance, in 2023, there was 136.2 billion gallons of motor gas use, and 14.3 billion gallons of ethanol use is expected. Looking out at 2050, that would, if there's only 106.7 billion gallons of motor gas use, then ethanol at 10% would only be 10.7 billion gallons. And so that would be, a reduction of 1.28 billion bushels of corn. So as we, think about, ethanol priorities were mentioned earlier. I also did kind of a back-end look. I want you to focus on the bottom half of this graph first. I should have covered up the top half. But another thing I looked at was, so in addition to their baseline projections through 2050, they also did 15 different scenarios of different policy types of things and price considerations. So I took the highest and lowest scenario in every year just to show that range of scenarios. So if we wanted ethanol to stay at a constant 14 billion gallons of use, I looked at what blend rate would be needed over time to maintain that usage. And so as we look out over the projections, the baseline projection would have us hitting around 13%, but notably the top end of that would be 15% just to maintain current use of ethanol. And then I also looked at what would, if we wanted ethanol to be 20 billion gallons constantly, what would the blend rates be needed in order to achieve that? And you can see here that, if we wanted to increase corn use in ethanol, that much higher blend rates are needed to achieve that. And I also wanted to note that EIA put out these projections in mid-March, and then the tailpipe emissions and electric vehicle type of standards came out in April. And I've been involved with a project that Illinois Corn is leading with Pro Exporter, and they are really digging deeper into specific analysis in terms of electric vehicle use. And I'll just say that until that is finalized, as we look at what those tailpipe emissions rules mean, it's likely that we would need an average of 20 to 25% blend rates to maintain about 14 to 15 billion gallons of ethanol use with those rules. So that'll be something to watch, more information on that coming forward. And then on the livestock demand side of things, beef cattle inventories are really low right now. Kind of the livestock industry has its own set of challenges in terms of head numbers and production. Poultry is recovering from avian influenza. Pork of course, has the issues with Proposition 12 in California and some other states following. And then, the drought impact on cattle and dairy that rely on, some of those pastures and the grain production for feed. And so, just kind of pointing out that really on all of our demand fronts, there's some challenges that we have ahead. And so this brings us to price, and we've got another question here. I'm asking is, do you think that the price outlook for corn, anyone can answer this, over the next 6 months is bullish or bearish, or are you unsure? So we've kind of set the stage for what could happen on the supply side and the demand side of things that could be, what I like to call market movers. So I'll give you all a minute we'll see where we're at. Well, the early responders are bearish people in here. So we'll give it a minute to see how those continue to move. They say that a farmer has to be like an eternal optimist, or they wouldn't still be farming. So I guess it's not surprising that we have a lot of bearish people, I'm saying this wrong. We have a lot of bearish people in the room. So I guess we're not showing our optimism. So definitely, as I've kind of said, we definitely have our challenges on the demand side. That big increase in acres on the supply side isn't helping. I know all of you want the highest yields possible on your farm, so if the drought impacts are not significant, then that's very welcome to each and every one of you. But when we, if we maintain that record yield level and record production level, that's definitely going to put pressure on prices going forward. And so, we need that demand going forward to support the production that you all can produce. So I've thought this was interesting throughout this year to see how 2023, this is December corn futures, has really tracked fairly closely with 2012 and 2013 throughout this year so far. We had this blip in June where it looked like we were sort of moving in the 2012 direction. There was a lot of weather market concerns and production concerns at that time. And then we sort of took a turn back downward between those higher acres and more rainfall coming throughout the country. And so, you see here that where we ended up on price in 2012 was $7.19. Where we ended up in 2013 was $4.20. This morning, December corn futures were $5.16 when I checked those. And so, as we look ahead, to what happens, I think the next couple weeks, I mentioned this earlier, but we'll watch what's happening with pollination over the next few weeks, where those yields end up. I'm also keeping a close eye on planted acres, and then of course, anything that we can, any positivity on the demand side that can help us out here with price. Okay, now macroeconomic factors. We're just going to talk inflation and interest rates for a few minutes. So another poll question anyone can respond to. So as we think about what's happening with inflation, it has come down some. We'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But I'm curious if in July, last week was Amazon Prime Day. I read that the Federal Reserve is keeping a close eye on Prime Day purchases as a measure of consumer spending. So did you make an Amazon Prime Day purchase last week? Have you purchased airline tickets so far in July? Have you bought, sold, or rented real estate at above market value? Or have you hired labor? I know a lot of you have employees on your farm. Have you paid an employee more than minimum wage? So if you could answer yes to any of these, then answer yes to this question here, or answer no if none of those apply to you. So again, Amazon Prime Day purchases, did you buy airline tickets yet in July? Above market value real estate transactions, or have you paid someone more than minimum wage? Let's see where our results are coming in. Okay. So it looks like, for some reason it's not showing the percent responses here, but Clearly, we have maybe about 75% yeses and 25% no's. So I did this question because I wanted to show that I assumed that there would be a lot of yeses between those things. And I wanted to show here that, we're still spending money, and we're, one of the big drivers of the current inflation phase has been the labor market. And the demand for labor, as I'm sure many of you know, we have this challenge on our own farm, but it's hard to get someone that can work and is willing to do the jobs that you have, and you usually have to pay them quite a bit to get a good person and qualified, capable person too. And so we can all relate to that, or many of us can relate to that. And then, anyways, here's consumer price index, where we've been and where we're at now. We hit the peak in June of last year at 9.1%. Currently, the July consumer price index that just came out last Thursday is 3%. So the Fed's target rate is 2%. So 3% is looking quite good, actually, from just this view. I want to note here, though, that from June to July, consumer price index dropped 1 whole entire percent. And it's a little bit deceiving because it had to do with it had less to do with the month of June in the this year, and more to do with the month of June last year. So these numbers are based on a 12-month rolling average. So June of last year fell out of this average, and June of this year was added in. June of this year actually didn't change much from May, but June of last year was like the huge month in terms of price. If you look at that, that's where we hit our price peak on the 12-month rolling average. There was a huge increase in price in June of last year. So when we lost June of last year in this 12-month average and added June of this year, it made a big move in the 12-month moving average. But if you look at the month-to-month, there wasn't really a huge improvement in inflation in the month of June. So just wanted to point that out. It looks kind of good from this view. There's some more dynamics underneath that. But what the Federal Reserve actually pays more attention to is what's called core inflation, which removes food and energy prices from the inflation numbers. And if we look at that, the July report for the month of June was actually 4.8%. So that indicates that we still have a ways to go to get down to that 2% Federal Reserve target rate. So as we look ahead to the Federal Reserve's meeting next week, what does that mean? The market is largely expecting another 25 basis point increase. Here is the federal funds rate hike cycles over the last quite a few decades, with 2022-23 there in the black. This is kind of their projected for the remainder of this year. We see a little increase, 25 basis point increase at this July meeting. Some are also saying that we might see another increase in September if inflation continues to be sticky when we get to that point. On the other end of the spectrum, there's also indicators of a recession later this year. So if we move into a recession phase, they're not likely to continue to keep raising interest rates. And then the FOMC participants do what they call this dot plot, where they mark their projected ranges for the next couple years. So this shows where the Federal Reserve FOMC members anticipate interest rates being. So I put in the top end of their projections and the bottom end of their projections to show kind of what we might expect on the range. The short takeaway here is that even if they don't keep raising rates, they're not likely to lower them anytime soon unless we do hit a recession phase in which they might have to react faster than anticipated. And then so going along with that, when are they going to lower rates? This kind of shows the average time between the Fed's last raising of rates and their first lowering of rates. And in the last 5 rate hike cycles, it's been about 11 months between their last increase. So if we have that last increase in July of this year, using the average historical, we might expect to see some decreases by the middle of next year. Okay, and then here's the Treasury yield spread, the yield spread between the 2-year and 10-year Treasury. This is a pretty solid recession indicator normally, and we have been in the negative zone below that 0 line in the middle for quite some time now, since last summer. And an inversion in this being below 0 has predicted the last 8 recessions. So this has hung out below 0 for quite a while now. You can see some of the gray bars represent recession periods. You can see here that for the last several recessions, we didn't dip below zero very long leading up to that, but we've been down there for a while. So there's lots of different recession indicators, but this is just one of them. But anyway, so that is where I plan to end. I know we are almost out of time. Neil told me to give him 5 minutes, and it is 9:55, so we are right on target. So I won't take any questions right here, but I will say that, I'll be around all week, so find me, ask me questions. I also love those of you who have been in the tech survey group. I'd love to hear from you on your thoughts on that. So thank you so much, and I look forward to talking to you all as we go through the rest of the week.